Hi everyone, and welcome to our second lesson in our study of the book of Ephesians. If this is your first time joining us, make sure that you click the link in the description to go check out lesson 1 of our study in the book of Ephesians, and then come back and watch this video on lesson 2. So we're going to be diving into chapter 2 of the book of Ephesians in our study today. And I just want to remind you before we begin about the big idea of the book of Ephesians. The big idea of the book of Ephesians is that who we are should inform how we live. Who we are should inform how we live. And that big idea is going to really play itself out in chapter 2 as we study it together. Now, I also want to give you the big idea of chapter 2 up front so that we can think about it as we walk through chapter 2 together. So the big idea of chapter 2 is that the gospel breaks down spiritual and physical barriers. Now, I'm sure that many of us have faced certain barriers or obstacles in our lives. Maybe it's been a physical limitation. Maybe you broke a bone or sprained an ankle, whatever it might be that kept you out of being active. That's a physical barrier. There's also other barriers like emotional barriers, where maybe you struggle with fear or anxiety or self-doubt, and those fears and anxieties and doubts keep you back from doing certain things that maybe some of your friends around you are freely doing. Whatever those barriers are, we all have those barriers come into our lives from time to time. Our son Ethan is about 15 months old now, and he's to the point where he's starting to really communicate with us. And so we've taught him 4 signs in sign language to help him communicate with us. And those 4 signs are please, thank you, more, and all done. One of his favorite ones right now is more, because he knows that he can ask for more snacks or more food or whatever it might be. But we use those signs to help break down the barrier of communication right now, because he's still obviously not talking at the moment, so he can use those signs to communicate with us. But even with those 4 signs, communication is still limited. There are times when he's clearly trying to ask for something, but my wife and I don't know what he's exactly asking because the communication is breaking down at some point. And so he realizes that we're not understanding him, so he gets frustrated that we aren't able to meet his needs. So he kind of runs around the room crying and sort of throwing a tantrum, but he's really frustrated because of the communication barrier that still exists, even though we can understand him a bit. And in chapter 2, we're going to see how the gospel breaks down these spiritual and physical barriers. Now, there's a word that's going to kind of tie all this together, and that word is reconciliation. Now, that's kind of a big Bible word that we often use in church, but what does reconciliation actually mean? Reconciliation means that something that was broken is now fixed. Something that was broken is now fixed. And in chapter 2, we're going to see how that plays out in our relationships with God, as well as our relationships with the people around us. So let's jump in to look at some of the key verses found in chapter 2. Let's start in chapter 2, verses 4 and 5, which says this: "But because of his great love for us, God, who is rich in mercy, made us alive with Christ, even when we were dead in our transgressions. It is by grace you have been saved." So this verse and the first 10 verses of Ephesians 2 are describing how sin separated us from God, but God went to great lengths to fix that relationship. He went to more than an awkward conversation or a rushed apology. It cost Jesus his life. And the death of Jesus made peace between us and God. Our sin made it impossible for us to have a relationship with God, but Jesus changed that. God removed everything that made us incompatible with him. Jesus broke down the barrier of sin so that we might have a restored relationship with Christ. And there are so many amazing aspects and descriptions of how God is working in this chapter. So we encourage you again this week to read through the entire chapter of the book of Ephesians, chapter 2 of the book of Ephesians, and to notice everything that God is doing to fix our relationship with him and our relationship with the people around us. Now, the second half of the chapter and our second key verse is going to address those physical barriers that we have in the relationships with the people around us. Look at chapter 2, verse 14. It says, "For he himself is our peace, who has made the two groups one, and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility." Now, the big question here is, what are these two groups? Well, these two groups are the Jews and the Gentiles. Now, Gentiles are simply everyone else who isn't Jewish. Now, just for a little context and background, the Jews were the people of God. They still are the people of God. And the Gentiles were not. They were on the outside looking in. I'm not sure if you've ever had a situation where you were on the outside looking in. Maybe it was a friend group that you wanted to be a part of, and they just haven't accepted you as a friend. So you're on the outside looking in to that group you wanted to be a part of. Or maybe it's an event or a party or an activity that you really wanted to be a part of, but for some reason or another weren't able to attend, and you then hear your friends posting about it, or see your friends posting about it on social media, and you hear them talking about how amazing or how great the event or party was. And there's that feeling inside of you that's maybe frustrated or angry because they were able to experience something that you were not able to be a part of. You were on the outside looking in. And that's how the Gentiles felt. But in the second half of chapter 2, Paul describes how the Gentiles are no longer on the outside, but now that they are a part and they are included. And Paul describes that in verse 13, because they have been brought near because of what Jesus has done for them. They are no longer excluded. And now that made the Jews angry, and it caused a lot of tension and division between Jews and Gentiles, because the Jews, they wanted to stay God's special people. They didn't want to share God with anyone else. But God has brought the Gentiles near, and now that they are part of the people of God. And we still face some of those same difficulties today, because we have people all the time that we don't like because they're simply not like us. But here's the thing. Just because someone is different than us doesn't mean that there has to be division between us. Just because someone is different than us doesn't mean there has to be division between us. Because here's the thing, going back to what we said about what God did for us in regards to the spiritual barriers, God had an endless list of reasons not to have a relationship with us because we rejected him. But he reconciled our relationship with him anyway. He removed everything that made us incompatible with him, and by doing that, God removed everything that made us incompatible with everyone else. So, I want to have some key takeaways from this chapter in the book of Ephesians. We cannot be right with God and wrong with someone else. We can't be right with God and wrong with someone else, because who we are should inform how we live. And if God has reconciled our relationship with him, how much more should we reconcile our relationships with others? The gospel helps us break down spiritual and physical barriers. So I want to ask you two questions in conclusion. Has the gospel changed you? If you are truly a follower of Jesus, who you are should inform how you live. And that should not only change your relationship with God, but your relationship with the people around you. Secondly, has the gospel changed how you view people? Because if the gospel hasn't changed how you view people, then you need to seriously consider if the gospel has changed you at all. Because remember, when you face situations where it seems impossible to reconcile or fix a relationship that's difficult or broken, or there's struggles there, remember what God did to restore our relationship with him. The gospel has the power to break down spiritual and physical barriers so that the world might know that we are followers of Jesus because of our love for one another. Thanks everybody for joining us in our second lesson in the study of our book of Ephesians. Make sure that you join us on Sunday for our live stream on our Sunday church gathering page on our website, as well as join us Wednesday as we're going to be hanging out in our small groups on Zoom together. We can't wait to see you guys there.